Charles Alden Seltzer, born 1875, died 1942, was among the most successful practitioners of the cowboy story during the first 4 decades of this century. Beginning in 1900, with the publication of his first novel, The Council of Three, Seltzer wrote highly romanticized and highly popular yarns about the rangelands of Arizona and other parts of the Southwest. Not all of his novels feature cowboys and cattlemen, but the best ones do. A Trail to Yesterday, 1913. Drag Harlan, 1921. A Son of Arizona, 1931. Silver Spurs, 1935. And Treasure Ranch, 1940. His most accomplished short stories are likewise cowboy adventures in his 2 collections, The Range Riders, 1911, and The Triangle Cupid, 1912, and The Unusual Christmas Tale, which follows. There was a light in 7-Up's dugout, and the light meant, of course, that 7-Up was at home. Breathing his pony on the crest of Gopher Hill after the long climb, Lascar glanced eagerly down the trail. Yes, the light was there. No doubt about that. Its presence meant that 7-Up was still active. It meant shelter, warmth, and companionship. 3 things which are highly desirable on a long trail in the middle of a chill November night. Lascar smiled as he approached the dugout. He knew as much about 7-Up as any man in the country knew, which, when a man got to reviewing his knowledge, was little enough. 7-Up was riding line for the Double R outfit. Everybody knew that. 7-Up was 65 years old. He had said so himself. And as there was nothing to be gained by lying about one's age, everybody believed him. 7-Up had been riding for the Double R for about 2 years. Everybody knew that too. It was not much to know about a man, but in this country, it was enough. When a man is willing to sit up until near daylight with you playing cards, even if, as a rule, he succeeds in winning about 9 out of every 10 games, you may safely assume that he likes you. An inveterate card player would rather beat a friend in a card game than an enemy in a fistfight. Therefore, being an inveterate card player, 7-Up took a keen delight in proving to Lascar that the latter had still very much to learn before he could hope to master even the rudiments of high-low jack and game. Infrequent as were Lascar's trips to town, he always managed so that on his return he would be able to pass the greater part of one night in 7-Up's dugout, playing 7-Up. Passing a night at 7-Up's saved a camp in the open with its attendant inconveniences. 7-Up usually regaled Lascar with hot frijoles and a soda biscuit, which was much better than cold bacon, crackers, and canned tomatoes. And a deep adobe fireplace, in which 7-Up cooked with Dutch ovens and frying pans, and before which one might toast one's feet, was much to be preferred to a wind-whipped fire on the open prairie, before which a man might nearly freeze. Therefore, considering the advantages afforded by the geographically admirable location of 7-Up's dugout, Lascar might well smile as he approached the light. At the noise he made in dismounting, 7-Up appeared in the doorway of the dugout. "Well, you got here, did you? I've been setting up waiting for you. Saw you hitting the breeze day before yesterday and figured you'd be sliding back this way about now." He emerged from the dugout and pulled the saddle from Lascar's pony while the latter removed the bridle and staked the animal out in the lee of the dugout wall. "Got some frijoles in the pot for you." "They've been blubbering right smart since sundown." 7-Up cackled mirthfully as he cleared a space on the rough board table and set some steaming food upon it. He sat and smoked while Lascar ate. He asked a few questions about town. Then, after the remains of the guests' feast had been cleared from the table, came the inevitable invitation to play cards. "7-Up?" questioned the inhabitant of the dugout. "You ain't got no show agin me tonight," he boasted as he caught Lascar's acquiescent nod. "Fit, I tell ya. They ain't no man can beat me playing 7-Up when I'm fit. I can play cards all around the man that made 'em." "You ain't forgetting to blow your own horn none, anyhow," grinned Lascar, pulling a bench up to the table. 7-Up cackled. "I'll catch your jack for that, first pop," he threatened, which he did on the very first deal, much to Lascar's disgust. "Reckon you got them cards marked," accused Lascar with some heat. It was not so much that he had just lost the jack, but that 7-Up had made good on his threat that caused Lascar a flash of anger. 7-Up laid his cards face down on the table, and leaning forward looked straight at Lascar, his bleared eyes full of reproach. "You know a heap better than that, lass," he said. "A heap better. I ain't never cheated no man playing 7-Up, nor in any other game. I'm too old to start now. Besides, I wouldn't do it in a friendly game, no how. But there's men that do mark their cards, lass. I've knowed 'em. I knowed one man which always made a point of marking all the high cards in every deck he ever played with. It didn't make no difference whether he was playing for money or not. He always marked the cards. Nobody ever catched on to him either, except me, and I catched on to it too late." He laughed oddly and took up the Jack of Hearts, laying it face down on the table and pressing the end of his thumbnail against the back, creating a deep impression in the card. He held it up so that Lascar might see. His eyes were very bright as he looked at Lascar. "See that thumb mark?" he questioned. "Well, you'll see that thumb mark is made up in a corner, but it's sort of round-like." "Yes," said Lascar, "a sort of semicircle." "That's it," said 7-Up, "a sort of semicircle. Well, the man I'm telling you about didn't make no semicircle when he marked the cards. He had a thumb which he had been smashed some time or other. Smashed bad. The nail had come off. When it growed back on, it didn't grow back like an honest, respectable nail, but growed crooked, like the man which owned it. It growed square, and it was the only square thing about that man. He played cards a heap, and he used to keep the end of that square thumbnail trimmed right across. And when he'd get a high card which he wanted to know when it was in some other man's hand, he'd press that square nail down onto it, close up to one of the corners of the card. Then he'd know it. He had different ways of pressing the nail down, so he'd know all the cards. Sometimes he'd make a triangle. Sometimes he'd stick the two corners of the square together and make a cross. He'd a dozen different ways of making signs, and he knowed all of them. He had a fine system. Well, 7-Up seemed about to take Lascar into his confidence, but apparently he decided not to and laughed harshly. "Your deal, lass," he said, and they resumed playing. They played for 2 hours in a silence broken only by monosyllabic grunts and expressed such terms and phrases as beg, stand, give, rub, the latter term being indicative of the progress of the game. Apparently 7-Up was fit, for he was a consistent winner. Along about 3 o'clock in the morning, disgusted with what he was pleased to call his luck, Lascar signified his intention of quitting the game and turning in. "Just one more," pleaded 7-Up. "You don't get here often, and I sure do like to beat you." At the conclusion of this game, Lascar was convinced that 7-Up was unbeatable, and he sought his blankets and pulled the ends of them up over his ears to deaden the sound of 7-Up's gloating cackles. Some time later, Lascar sat suddenly up in his bunk, wide awake, listening intently. A wind was wooing and shrieking through the eaves of the dugout, coming in heavy gusts against the north wall. The fire in the adobe fireplace was low. Lascar was chilled through in spite of the heavy blanket in which he was wrapped. He reached out one hand and brushed it over the blanket, and then started up with an exclamation of surprise. "Snow!" he said. In an instant he was out of the bunk, throwing the blankets off, striding to the door and opening it. He was forced back by a bitter, driving, snow-laden wind that filled the world outside. He closed the door and stood against it, scowling. Then he went to 7-Up and shook him savagely. "Roll out," he ordered. "The bottom's dropped out of the sky." 7-Up clambered out of his bunk, rubbing his eyes, and when his vision cleared, he fixed his gaze on the window in the side of the dugout. The glass, 7-Up himself had brought it from town, was blurred, and fine frozen snowmeal swished against it, sifting through the crevices in the sash and drifting thinly into the bunk in which Lascar had been sleeping. "A norther," said 7-Up passionlessly. "She's a-comin' through the window from the north. That settles two things. I don't ride no line today, nor maybe for several days, and you don't go home. 40 miles? You'd never make it. You couldn't ride 5. "Don't I know it?" flared Lascar, scowling. "I don't need you to tell me." His wife would worry about him, and yet perhaps not. She might think he had delayed starting from town. Lascar buttoned up his coat and went outside, closing the door after him. A wild white smother entered the dugout while the door was open. It swirled and settled, leaving a new chill. Outside, Lascar was nearly swept off his feet by the wind, a whirling, stinging, blinding blast that bit clear through his clothing. The sky was gone, obscured by an impenetrable smother of fleece. Objects, old landmarks that Lascar knew well, were not to be seen. He tried to peer northward, homeward. The fine, flinty snow blinded him. The wind took his breath. He could not see a foot that way. He turned his back with a curse and sought his pony, finding it huddled against the wall of the dugout. The animal nickered appealingly when it saw him, and he untied it and led it into a windbreak beside 7-Up's horse. He fed both animals from 7-Up's store and then made his way back to the dugout. 7-Up was placidly stirring the frijoles in the pot that he had placed over the fire. "Going home?" he questioned at Lascar's entrance without looking up. "Home? Hell," returned Lascar irritably. "Tell you what," offered 7-Up as they breakfasted. "This here norther reminds me of the one we got last year, about this time too, on the last day of November. Or is this the last? Today's the first day of December." "Well, I ain't no hand to keep track of time, but that there storm we got last year this time was such a hummer. Early for this country, but it stayed a whole month. I didn't get to town for no Christmas last year." "I'm going to go home for Christmas," declared Lascar. "Why, sure, I reckon this won't last." 7-Up dished up another plate of frijoles for himself, Lascar declining another. The two passed the remainder of the day playing cards. 7-Up. They retired early, and the next morning when Lascar arose and eagerly stuck his head out through the doorway, the blizzard raged with unabated fury. Closing the door, he walked silently back to the fire, throwing a fresh log upon it. Then he sat down on a bench and stared gloomily at the licking flames. A little later, 7-Up rolled out of his blankets. He said nothing to Lascar, but went to the door and looked out. The two breakfasted in silence. They played cards until dinner time, and then, neither man being hungry, they played through until supper time. They had beans again, and soda biscuit. After the table was cleared, they resumed their card playing. It was 7-Up. That was the only game 7-Up knew, the only one he cared to know. He would play no other. The proportion of 7-Up's victories remained the same, about 9 in 10. Lascar had been beaten so much that he no longer saw any humor in 7-Up's uncanny luck. Both ceased to joke about the game, but played in grim earnest, with a concealed animus that presaged trouble. It was midnight when they agreed to quit. Lascar had won 3 games, 7-Up 27. Instead of having abated during the night, the next morning they found the blizzard raging with increased fury. "We're holed up right," mourned Lascar as he stood peering out through a 2-inch opening in the door. "Likely we'll stay here till spring. There's steers drifting, plenty of them. Fences won't hold them in this storm." "Nothin'll hold them," seconded 7-Up. "If this storm keeps up, the gracers will have plenty stocked next season if the cattle don't freeze to death." Lascar closed the door and came towards the table yawning. "Might as well play 7-Up," he said. "Want some frijoles?" queried 7-Up. Lascar turned on him fiercely. "To hell with your beans! I'm sick of them." "Shucks," said 7-Up placatively. "They're good enough when you ain't got nothing better." "Eat 'em then," sneered Lascar. "Some folks don't want nothing better. It all depends on how a man's been raised." 7-Up did not answer, but gave his attention to the portion of beans that he had helped himself to. Table etiquette was a thing with which 7-Up had never bothered, nor had Lascar. 7-Up ate as he always ate, with his knife, masticating loudly with open mouth. It was not a pretty spectacle, nor were the noises nice things to hear, and Lascar himself practiced the same method. Yet he watched 7-Up furtively, a sneer on his lips, his gaze malevolent. "Maybe you just as soon stop eating like a pig at a swill trough," he said presently, his voice writhing with suppressed rage. 7-Up looked at him with a smile of mild defiance. "There ain't nothing wrong with my eating. I've always eaten this way, and I ain't stopping it now." He prepared another knifeful of the beans and lifted them preparatory to placing them in his mouth. "Put them down, damn you!" flared Lascar. He jerked out his .45 and shoved its muzzle close to 7-Up, his eyes burning with anger. "I don't care how you vet," he declared. "You ain't going to do no swilling whilst I'm looking at you." 7-Up slowly lowered the knife. "Lass," he said gently, "you ain't naturally mean. Being holed up here has got on your nerves. So soon, too. I was hoping we'd be able to get along. Why, last year, when I was holed up here alone, I stood it 20 days before I got to quarreling with myself and seeing things." Lascar reluctantly sheathed his gun, grinning with embarrassment. "I reckon that's right," he agreed. "It ain't your eating, it's me. It's curious how a little thing like being holed up will bother a man." "Right curious," affirmed 7-Up. He took up his knife again, but though Lascar was apparently mollified, 7-Up took care not to rouse him again, mincing his food delicately. During the day, they took turns at the window and door, watching cattle drift by. There was an endless procession of them, now a mere dribble, now a surging wave of gaunt bodies and tossing horns, a tide that no human agency could stop. Late in the afternoon, 7-Up gave up watching them and turned his attention to the pot of frijoles. Lascar paid no attention to him, standing beside the window watching steadily, frowning at this thing which was keeping him from going home. 7-Up did not invite him to partake of the frijoles when he lifted them steaming from the pot, fearing a recurrence of his anger. He ate his own meal stealthily, keeping a watchful eye on his companion and quietly removing the dishes when finished. But he need not have been concerned over Lascar's probable conduct. The latter was master of himself now. His clash with 7-Up had merely provided an outlet for the bitter rage and disappointment he felt over being caught 40 miles from home by the Norther. He was not likely to lose his temper again, so he told himself as he thought over the incident. 7-Up had boasted of his self-possession on a former occasion, but on the morning of the 10th day of their imprisonment, he crawled out of his bunk and looked at Lascar with a strange light in his eyes. "Them cattle's been going past here all night," he said. "Black cattle, all black. They must have been 1,000,000 of them, with a woman driving. It was my daughter. She done waved to me and she said she's coming back this way, 'fore long. Told me to wait for her, but I don't reckon she'll come back. I've waited 20 years. He went to the door, opened it, and was about to go outside when Lascar seized him by the arm and drew him away, closing the door. 7-Up struggled, though his strength was not what it should have been, and he was a child in Lascar's grasp. "Let me be," he argued. "I'm going to look for her." "Why, man, I can't let her go like that." He fought with Lascar, but he was carried bodily to his bunk and placed in it, muttering, "She'll sure freeze to death out there." "I reckon she would if she was out there," agreed Lascar. "But she ain't there, and your own gizzard would be a hunk of ice before you'd travel 1/4 of a mile." 7-Up cackled, and on the morrow, when he regained control of himself and remembered, he was not exactly pleased. He tried to be pleasant to Lascar, but the two had been cooped up together so long that being pleasant was a difficult matter. The dusk in the dugout was perpetual, the air stale, but there was no relief. Indeed, as the days passed, the Norther seemed to encompass them more surely. The snow piled in huge drifts against the walls of the dugout. They watched the drift by the window grow gradually higher and creep toward the top, slowly shutting out what little light they had. "Ought to get that snow away from there," observed 7-Up on the morning of the 15th day. "Pretty soon we won't have no light at all." "Get it away then, you," answered Lascar shortly, and returned to his bunk to sleep. 7-Up did not reply. He was slowly beginning to believe that Lascar was imposing on him. He reasoned that Lascar had accepted his hospitality, was eating his food and sharing his fire, and therefore he ought to do something toward running the establishment. Why couldn't he have gone out and shoveled the snow away from the window? He was stubborn, that was why. Well, let him be stubborn, and let the snow stay there. He would never go out and shovel it away. During his 2 years' acquaintance with Lascar, he had never seen him in the light in which he saw him now. He had thought Lascar to be a whole-souled fellow, energetic and eager to do anything to help a friend along. But here he was proving himself a small, mean, narrow-minded, contemptible lazybones. Why, he didn't want to do anything. He had loafed in the dugout while 7-Up had gone to the spring for water, not once, but several times, and it was a good 100 yards to the spring, and it was frozen over, and there was ice to be chopped before the water could be secured. He wouldn't cook or wash the dishes, and he complained of the food. Lascar had been feeding the horses, though, which was something. But the more 7-Up meditated over the fact, the more convinced he became that Lascar had some ulterior purpose in exhibiting industry in this particular chore. He began to suspect that Lascar was favoring his own beast in the matter of feed. He decided to investigate, and waited until he thought Lascar was asleep. He was opening the door when he heard Lascar's voice. "Where you going?" 7-Up's eyes blazed with anger. Lascar suspected the object of his errand and did not want him to investigate. Wasn't that proof? "You're starving my horse," he snarled. "I'm going out to feed him." Lascar threw himself back in the bunk, laughing huskily. "Sure," he said, his lips quivering with the anger that he was trying to suppress. "I'm starving your horse. If you knowed that, why ain't you been doing your own feeding, instead of depending on me to do it for you? You're too damn lazy, that's why." 7-Up halted with his hand on the door. "I wouldn't say that again, lass, if I was you," he said. "Why wouldn't you?" Lascar raised himself on one arm and leered at 7-Up. "Because I'm telling you not to." 7-Up's voice sank to a furious, throaty whisper. "Because I'm telling you, that's why," he repeated. "If you chirp one little wee chirp again about me being lazy, I'm getting daylight through you aplenty. I ain't telling you again." Such clashes did not encourage harmony. They erected a barrier of distrust and suspicion, which almost reached a climax when one night, about the 20th of their enforced companionship, the two men lay in their bunks opposite each other, glaring an unspeakable hatred. Hatred was bound to develop sooner or later. These two men had been accustomed to riding forth on their daily rounds in the open. They had been free to come and go as they pleased, living frugally, enjoying the clear, pure, wholesome air of the plains, sleeping out of doors, reveling in their limitless world, being a part of the general bigness of things. Here, they were cooped up. It would not have made so much difference if they could have gone on an occasional ride, if they could have avoided seeing each other for even one night. They would have succeeded in securing a new grip on themselves then, would have taken a new delight in each other's company. But they had seen too much of each other. Even a bridal couple on their honeymoons soon tire of the monotony of being left to their own devices, and if someone does not save them from themselves, discord soon spoils the dream. But no one came to save Lascar and 7-Up, and they had no dream to wake from. It was all stern, bitter, unlovely reality. Their minds dealt on trivialities, dormant fires of passion, primitive and uncontrollable, flared forth constantly, threatening an eruption. Lascar would lie for hours in his bunk, his gaze fixed on 7-Up, watching the way the latter puffed at his pipe, sneering when the smoker's lips curled around the stem of the pipe, sneering when they were in repose. Nothing that 7-Up did suited Lascar. 7-Up found nothing in Lascar's actions and general demeanor at which he could not cavil. They had reached the breaking point. For hours they lay in their bunks, watching each other furtively. Lascar would feign sleep, and then suddenly open his eyes to catch 7-Up looking at him. The action would be reversed. Suspicion grew quickly in this fertile field, but along toward morning, Lascar's eyes grew heavy. He could stay awake no longer. He sneered at 7-Up. "Oh, hell," he said. "Stick a knife in me if you wanna." And he deliberately rolled over, turning his back to 7-Up. The latter lay quiet for a long time, certain that Lascar was pretending to sleep in order to invite an attack so that he might kill him. But 7-Up was not to be caught thus. He waited, fighting sleep, until there was no further doubt that Lascar was really unconscious. Then he crept noiselessly out of his bunk and deftly removed Lascar's knife and gun. Then, with a subdued cackle, he slipped back into his bunk and dropped off to sleep, satisfied. But his dreams were troubled. He kept seeing cattle, black cattle. His daughter was driving them in the storm, her slight figure cringing from the wind. He talked in his sleep of many strange things, of a troubled past, of a dead wife and motherless girl, a girl whom he worshipped and who had been led away by a card player. Aroused from sleep by 7-Up's mutterings, Lascar turned his face and listened. 20 years, said 7-Up mournfully and despairingly. "It's been 20 years, and I ain't seen no sign of her. Likely she's dead or worse, or she'd have been back before this. Bill Henley, he's got her. Henley couldn't play square. The only thing that was square about Henley was his damn thumbnail, and he cheated with that." Then he wandered off into incoherence, and Lascar resumed his interrupted sleep. Late the next morning, Lascar awoke to hear 7-Up grumbling about the food supply. It was about exhausted. By scraping the pot, they obtained enough frijoles for breakfast, and Lascar gagged over these. Once a month, the supply wagon visited 7-Up. He would have had plenty to last him until the Double R wagon came again, and he had not been compelled to share with Lascar. They were both facing starvation now, and it was Lascar's fault. 7-Up yielded to bitterness. "You've et more than your share," he complained over the table after the last morsel of food had disappeared. "You've been a damned hog all along, that's what." "You're a liar," said Lascar huskily. His eyes wore a horribly malignant expression as he leered at 7-Up across the table. "I tell you, you're a damned hog," repeated 7-Up shrilly. If he could goad Lascar into attacking him, he would have an excuse to kill him, and thus rid himself of a being that he had come to loathe. He cackled insanely as Lascar clutched at his empty holster and searched in vain for his knife. "I knowed it," he declared with conviction. "You've been wanting to kill me all along. That's why I took your knife and gun. I've got him hid out, but I'm keeping my own." "That ain't no way to treat a man," protested Lascar. "Give me my knife and gun." "They're done hid out, I told you," cackled 7-Up. "You don't get 'em. You was gonna kill me last night. You was waiting till I got to sleep, but I reckon I done fooled you here. I done fooled you considerable. I got 'em right after my daughter went by, driving them black steers." Into Lascar's eyes came a designing gleam. "Sure you got 'em then, but I wasn't gonna kill you, 7-Up. I wouldn't do nothing like that. Give me my knife back and my gun, and I'll go out and catch your daughter and bring her back. She can't be gone far." 7-Up laughed discordantly. "You ain't fooling me none, lass. You don't want to look for my daughter. That's just a game to get your knife and gun. You don't get 'em. Anyway, my daughter's coming back. She drives them black steers past here every little while. When she comes past again, I'm getting her myself." Lascar went to the window and slowly scraped the frost from the glass. He stood there for a long time, looking out at the swirling snow. There was no indication of a break. "I reckon we're done for," he said more to himself than to 7-Up. "There ain't no signs of a let-up." He could feel his self-control going. He knew that he would soon be in the same condition as 7-Up, for he could see many things out in the snow that he knew were not there, and strange thoughts flitted through his mind. Once he found himself laughing, though in a flash of sober sense he knew there was nothing at which to laugh. Once, while looking out of the window, he thought he saw a pony and rider approaching the dugout, and he came very near to calling 7-Up to see too, so real did they appear. But he knew it was his brain trying to make a fool of him, and so he decided to keep silent and not give 7-Up a chance to laugh at him. It was curious, though, how he kept seeing the horse and rider. It was a black horse, and he thought perhaps it was the same horse that 7-Up had seen, though there were no black cattle about, and the rider of the horse was not a woman, but a man. Also, the man appeared to be frozen to the saddle, for, though Lascar could not see his face, the man sat in a queer position, his head bowed and his body strangely slack. Lascar had been much interested in 7-Up's rambling references to his daughter. Something in 7-Up's recital had struck him as strangely familiar. It sounded like a story that he had heard in the long ago, or had it happened to himself? He was not certain. He could not be certain of anything, with his brain forming curious fantasies of thought, drawing odd pictures of unreal things, perplexing him, hurting him, but he felt an overpowering curiosity in the matter of 7-Up's daughter. Then, too, he had heard 7-Up speak of a town named Milford. He had heard of Milford, but could not recollect having been there. 7-Up had said he was from there, but had Lascar been there, or had he merely talked to some other person about the town? Some person besides 7-Up. If he had been there, all well and good, but if he had heard of the town from someone besides 7-Up, that would indicate that he might have heard the story of the lost daughter from some other source as well. He turned to 7-Up, who was sitting in a chair twirling his thumbs and grinning idiotically at them. Oh, he couldn't talk to that beast, but curiosity forced the question through his lips. "What's your right name?" 7-Up stopped twirling his thumbs and looked at him through blurred, vacuous eyes. "Which?" he inquired. "What's your right name?" 7-Up's eyes flashed with a cunning, maniacal light. "You want to know my name so you can tell Bill Henley to look out for me, but I ain't telling nobody but Bill Henley. I'll find him someday and then I'll tell him." He resumed twirling his thumbs, though he kept a wary eye on Lascar. The latter asked no more questions, but crawled into his bunk and went to sleep. For an hour, 7-Up sat watching and twirling his thumbs. Then he, too, sought his bunk. Late that afternoon, the sky cleared. The snow ceased. The wind died down. A cold sun, hanging in its rim on a mountain peak, bathed the world in a shimmering, glittering, blinding light. Neither Lascar nor 7-Up was conscious of the change. They had sunk into a lethargic state, which was so near to complete unconsciousness that they no longer took any interest in anything, not even their hatred for each other. For 2 days they lay in their bunks, not stirring out of them, even to feed the horses. During the last day of the storm, the snow had drifted above the window in the dugout, shutting out the light, and when, on the morning of the 24th day, Lascar staggered out of his bunk, the interior of the dugout was in semi-darkness. For an instant after getting out of the bunk, Lascar stood beside it, glumly surveying the drift at the window. "Hell," he said, "what's the use of worrying? It's still snowing and we're done for." Steadying himself, he walked across the floor and seized 7-Up roughly by the shoulder. "Pile out, you old fool, you're sleeping your head off. We're going to play our harps pretty soon, and we might well tune up now. Let's play 7-Up. It took 7-Up some minutes to sit erect, and when he did, it was easy to see that he was not standing the strain of hunger and lonesomeness as well as Lascar. There was an unnatural color in his face, and an insane light in his eyes. Only the latter part of Lascar's speech interested him. "7-Up," he said. "Sure, I reckon I'll play 7-Up. Why, 7-Up's my name, ain't it?" He slipped down and tottered across the floor to the table. Lascar took a seat opposite him. The latter's curiosity regarding 7-Up's identity had not abated. He was determined to uncover this mystery before the end came. He hesitated while shuffling the cards, and looked at 7-Up. Reaching into a pocket, he drew out a handful of currency and laid it on the table. "We're playing for something," he said. "I'm putting this roll up. If you win, you get it. If you lose, you tell me your right name. That go?" 7-Up braced himself by holding to the table while he looked at Lascar. "My name?" he said thickly, his face clouding with incomprehension. Then his eyes flashed craftily. "You can't win, lass. I can beat the man that made the cards." "It goes then," suggested Lascar. "Deal," returned 7-Up. "If you win, I tell you my name. But you can't win." He went off into a gale of wild laughter. Lascar did not win. 7-Up swept Lascar's money over the table and jeered at him, but Lascar produced more money, and they played again. Again, 7-Up won. He was a consistent winner. Along toward the middle of the afternoon, Lascar announced that he was broke, and 7-Up started to count his winnings. He was cackling over them, counting and recounting, and each time getting a different total when he saw Lascar fumbling in a pocket and stopped counting to watch him. Lascar finally pulled out a gold chain and locket and placed them on the table in front of him. "I'm putting this up," he said. 7-Up dropped the money to the table, seized the locket, and drew it over to him. The sight of it wrought a wonderful change in him. The insane light died out of his eyes and was succeeded by a cold, metallic gleam. The hectic color disappeared from his face and was replaced by a queer, unnatural pallor, the white of cold ashes. "Lass," he said in a low, intense voice, "where did you get this locket?" "It's my wife's." "What's it your business?" "What's your wife's name?" continued 7-Up, ignoring Lascar's question. "Amy." What was her last name before she married you?" "Leggett," announced Lascar, his interest finally aroused. 7-Up's eyes slowly closed. The hand holding the locket was clenched about it so tightly that Lascar was beginning to fear for the delicate thing when he saw that 7-Up was staring at his left hand, staring intensely, his eyes aflame. "What in the hell you looking at?" demanded Lascar, a surge of the old anger and hatred sweeping over him. "I never noticed it before," said 7-Up, paying no attention to Lascar's anger. "It's curious that I never noticed before that you'd lost a part of your thumb. How long ago?" "When I was 13 years old," retorted Lascar coldly. "What's it your business?" "You lost it when you was 13 years old?" said 7-Up huskily, leaning far over the table, his lips suddenly twitching, his hands working strangely. 13, I said, returned Lascar. "You're a damn liar!" suddenly shrieked 7-Up. The bench upon which he had been sitting was overturned, and he swayed against the table, trembling with excitement. "You're a liar!" he screamed again. "You lost it within the last 20 years! You're Bill Henley, damn you, Bill Henley!" He reached for his holster to find it empty. Making queer, throaty noises, he left the table and tottered to the door, opening it and staggering out into the snow toward the windbreak where the horses were tethered. Lascar followed, a growing fear in his eyes. When 7-Up reached the windbreak, he fumbled for a moment under a pile of snow-covered straw, bringing forth the knife and gun he had taken from Lascar. He straightened up, evidently thinking that Lascar was still in the dugout, and surprised to see Lascar behind him. He hesitated an instant, and then flung the six-shooter to a poise. At that instant, Lascar hurled himself forward, striking savagely at the hand holding the weapon. He succeeded in knocking the pistol from 7-Up's grasp, and it hurtled several feet away and was buried in a snowdrift. 7-Up snarled and tried to use the knife, but Lascar seized his arm. Locked tightly, fighting silently and desperately, they reeled around in the snow. 7-Up's advanced age was against him, but he was fighting with a ferocity that had 20 years of mediated vengeance behind it, and for a time it seemed he would be able to get his knife hand free. A dozen times he came very near to twisting the arm loose, but Lascar's agility saved him, and his younger muscles did not fail. They crashed against a corner of the dugout and rebounded to the edge of a huge snowdrift. There, Lascar exerted his strength, forcing 7-Up back into the drift. 7-Up stumbled against something, lost his balance, tried desperately to regain it, dropping the knife. 7-Up's feet slipped and he went down, Lascar on top of him. Lascar, tired with his exertions, lay with his full weight on 7-Up. "Don't!" complained 7-Up feebly. "You're hurting me, lass." "Get off," he whined with pain. "Get off, lass. I'm laying across a rock." Lascar wriggled to one side, and fearing that this might be a ruse of 7-Up's to escape and attack him again, he swept a hand around underneath the ladder to investigate. The hand came into contact with something that made Lascar withdraw his hand with a suddenness that caused him to roll off 7-Up and into the snow on the other side of him. But he was on his feet in an instant, calling to 7-Up, and together they clawed at the snowdrift, presently disclosing the body of a man, a dead man, rigid and ghastly. Lascar rose and passed his hand uncertainly over his eyes and forehead. The dead man's eyes, open and staring, seemed to be fixed on him. The face was the face of the man he had seen riding the black horse many nights ago, or was it yesterday? It did not matter. This was the man. What had become of the horse? Mechanically, he looked around at the windbreak. A black horse stood there, snuggled between the other two, his and 7-Up's. "I reckon I wasn't dreaming," he said aloud. "He done froze to death right close to the dugout. He was freezing while I was looking at him and thinking I was dreaming. Hey!" he suddenly shouted in tones of horror, for 7-Up was astride of the dead man, clutching at his left hand, screaming with rage and calling out that he had found Bill Henley. In proof of this, he held up to Lascar's gaze a left hand on which was a curiously deformed thumbnail. Lascar did not stop to examine the nail, but pulled 7-Up from the body. He was fighting viciously to keep 7-Up away when he heard shouts and saw a half-dozen cowboys approaching, his own men. They got 7-Up back into the dugout and regaled him with whiskey and food. They told Lascar how his wife had worried about him and how finally she had sent them to look for him. They gave him whiskey too. That night, they played cards. They made the dugout ring with hoarse laughter and ribald song. They played poker. They cursed and yelled and danced. It was all sweet music to 7-Up and Lascar, what they heard of it. For early in the evening, before the hilarity had reached its fullness, Lascar and 7-Up were in the bunks, peacefully snoring. Nothing could happen to them now. Christmas Day dawned, clear and cold. The air in the dugout reeked with the scent of cooking food. Woefully weak, but nearly rational, 7-Up sat up in his bunk and looked around him. "Say," he said to the figures that flitted about him, "are you real gents, or am I still seeing things?" "See if this is real, you old son of a gun," said one, passing the whiskey bottle to him. 7-Up took a drink of it, smacked his lips. "Didn't think I'd ever get acquainted with that there stuff again," he grinned. He saw Lascar seated at the table, partaking of the steaming food that was on a plate before him. "Say," he called, "was I dreaming things, or did I hear you say that your wife's name was Amy Leggett? Don't lie to me, lass," he pleaded. "I reckon you wasn't dreaming, father-in-law," grinned Lascar, his mouth full of food. 7-Up passed a hand over his forehead. "And I was dreaming and seeing things when I thought I'd found Bill Henley out there in the snow," he asked hesitatingly. "You wasn't dreaming none them either," returned Lascar. "The boys searched him before they planted him, and there was stuff on him, letters and such, to prove he was Bill Henley all right." 7-Up sighed deeply and lay back in the bunk. For a long time he lay there, listening to the sounds made by the punchers as they feasted and drank. Then he sat up again. "Lass," he inquired, "there's something that ain't been explained yet. I always thought Bill Henley had something to do with Amy leaving home. Did he?" "Hush, you old fool," said Lascar softly. "That's a story that Amy'll tell you when we get back tonight."